So we're going to have two panels. It's going to be a little bit long, but we're hopefully going to make this interactive with you all, particularly because this will be a lot like what a roundtable meeting is, which is not very well organized, a lot of people disagreeing with each other, and we don't know what's going to happen. But let me just say a couple of things, and I'll say to our panelists, I'm going to get to the slide that's got the overview of the process, and then these folks will each make some remarks. And then what we're going to do is kind of give you a history. You know, what is a plan? Well, first you got to know where you are, right? So how did I get here? Where do I think I'm going? How am I going to get there? And how will I know when I arrive that I got to the right place? So this panel is intended to give you all some background of how we got here, and then the next panel will bring in the folks, the five-piece orchestra that we've got that's putting this thing together. To understand the roundtable, you have to understand we really only have two things we don't like: change and the way things are now. And between those two paradigms, we're having a dialogue. So let me walk you through this real quick, and then I'm going to let each of these folks make some remarks. They've served their debt to society. You can read about that in their backgrounds. Okay, so how do we go here? Okay. Come on, baby. Baby. Okay, so we're going to talk briefly, what is a roundtable? What are we charged with? This phrase, meeting the needs, the four legs of the stool, where we were in 2012 and where we are now. So a little background for those of you who don't know. First of all, who all is on the roundtable or been to a roundtable meeting? Okay, so you guys can get a cup of coffee. This will just take a minute. The real key, I think, to the roundtables was they were organized by basins, and they gave standing for folks that traditionally had not been in the water dialogue, particularly environmental and rec users and land use authorities, county commissioners and municipal reps. Two from each county, conservancy and conservation districts. Those are the folks that are generally up here. But then 10 at-large members for agriculture, industrial, small water providers. So really the idea of having all the voices. We have about 40 active members today. We've got 55 available seats, so we're a very large roundtable. And also we have our liaison agencies. Parks and Wildlife's been very participatory. The folks from the Bureau show up, BLM. So it's been really nice to have those folks and their voices in the room. The Water for the 21st Century Act charged the roundtables with actively seeking input. So that's a part of the message today, is we want to hear from you, and to propose projects and methods to meet the needs. So how did we get to where we were going? We've actually been going at it 10 years. The original meetings were technical roundtable meetings. They started in 2003 on the tail, in the middle really, of that 2002 to 2004 drought. And there was a recognition that municipal growth was driving supply decisions. And so these are the sequence of events from Swazi 2004, and we'll talk about each of these in turn. But since I met some of these folks at that very first meeting, I'm going to stop and we'll go down here to Terry and just go down the row and let them give you just a couple minutes of their experience of being a roundtable member.
We basically were charged in Swazi to give an estimation of what we felt the unmet need was for our areas of focus. So we compiled that information after over 2 years of meetings, and from that we were able to come up with a gap, and that was basically an M&I gap. And over the years, we've developed information on what the non-consumptive needs are that are still unmet, as well as the consumptive, and we've begun the process of trying to identify what the agricultural gap is. Whether that is a
Terry, can you get a little closer?
Yeah, whether that is a gap in. Okay, Okay, is that better?
No.
How about that?
No.
I'll just use Jim's.
Good luck. That's as far as they let me go.
This is exactly like a round table meeting.
Yeah, this is really a lot like a round
This is a
table.
lot like.
Come on up and stand at the podium.
That's all right.
That's
I'll just get up
portable.
here.
You guys, yeah, there you go.
I'll use Gary's notes. No, that's right. So we started looking at the ag gap, and some of that we discussed was, what is the ag gap? How do you identify that? Is it a food gap? Do you do it on that basis? And if it's a food gap, do you calculate what that food gap is that could be met by the Arkansas drainage? And what does that working backwards mean in terms of the amount of water that's needed to meet that demand that's not being fulfilled by our agricultural industry? So that's being kicked around. I don't think we've come to a conclusion as to exactly what that is yet. So that's where some of the focus is presently. At least some of our group is working on that. We also went into further finalize or to be a little bit finer on what the M&I gap really is. And as far as the Upper Arkansas is concerned, we went in and started looking at since we do augmentation, a lot of augmentation for domestic as well as some industrial and some municipal uses within our area of focus. We do a lot of augmentation for that. In most of those are wells. We looked at what the availability of what the aquifer could support, could sustain. Our early studies through our well networks actually calculated that there was an ample supply of groundwater, alluvial groundwater in our area, in the Upper Arkansas, to support the wells that were being augmented and so forth, and those uses. But one thing we didn't know was we may have a pretty good supply of alluvial storage. What we didn't know was what the recharge rates were. So can that be sustained over a long period of time? So we're just, in our case, we're just finishing a final study that USGS will come out with to show what that water balance is and hopefully what the interaction is between surface water and groundwater and what the storage component could be, alluvial storage could be. And storage gets us into another segment of discussion I think Gary's going to take us to, so I'm going to stop there.
Right.
I'm Jim Broderick, and I've been here since day one, part of it because I wanted to make sure what everybody else was doing more than what was going on. But we really did start working on SWASI and trying to figure out what the gap was and what the gap meant. A lot of effort went into trying to understand that, and it's progressed over the years. I think has changed. The perspective of what the gap is has changed from the earlier days. The discussion that went on early was unmet needs. And the definition of unmet needs was, well, do you have enough water to make it till 2040, 2030, somewhere in that area? And so everybody would look at their portfolios and say, oh no, we're pretty good or we're not so good. But different segments within the basin felt they had bullseyes on. And that bullseye is indeed correct. They did have bullseyes on them, specifically agriculture, as we all know. But those of us that deal with trans-mountain diversions also felt as though there was a bullseye on you because everybody was very nervous about, well, are you coming to get more? And then not one more drop discussion kind of came into place. As we learn to know each other, I call this process therapy for the first 4 years. I think probably because there wasn't a big trust value. Not to mention going to another basin and having discussions. It's just your own basin. to have a discussion about, can you really put the cards on the table? Can you have an adult conversation? And it took a while to get to the adult conversation. Once we got to the adult conversation, everybody started to understand the basin, started to understand some of the issues that are very, very complex. So we had a ton of education going on that went everywhere from the unmet needs to the M&I gap, to the ag gap, to what recreation needs, to what non-consumptive needs are for environmental, to storage, to all those issues, to where you could start to have discussions. I will tell you, it was done in water time, very slow, extremely slow. For those of you that like to see things get done fast, I do not recommend coming. It takes a little while. But once you get there, and once you develop the discussions, and we found the same when we would go into other basin roundtables, and there's a different relationship that have established for the give and take for those basins we've been able to talk to. I believe there started to be some consensus. What then happened is kind of interesting because the makeup of the table started to change. People either came in new or replaced people, or people got tired of waiting for a solution. Some of the things I think were very successful were projects that were accomplished, and I'm sure Jairus will talk about some of those because that's a very proud place for the basin. I'm of the belief that, as some of the comments earlier this morning, we can no longer think of ourselves or our basins. We have to think as a state as a whole. And that's a hard thing to get yourself around when you're being paid by somebody right here. But if we don't start thinking as a whole, we will not do justice to Colorado or to the Arkansas Basin or any basin. And I think that the issues that we will need to talk about as we move through are multiple benefits to users and all users, to how ATMs will be developed. You cannot do any of these things without storage. So you're going to have storage. To the dismay of some other basins, I think new supply will need to be on the table. And Mike, I appreciate letting us have a Trans Mountain diversion from the Rio Grande.
Is that $1?
It's $1. We decided to put a pump back and forth so we could go either direction. I also believe that regulations are going to be a major issue, whether they're water quality or state regulations with regards to augmentation plans, as Terry mentioned, Rule 10 plans for improvements, the amount of water necessary for those. And beyond all that is how do you ensure you protect the prior appropriations document? And so it's not an easy task, but it's one I think can be done. And as we move through the panel, I think you'll start to see some of the successes and some of the future opportunities that we have.
Great. Jay?
Thank you. My name is Jay Winter. I'm the general manager of the Lower Arkansas Valley Water Conservancy District. I also sit on the IBCC. One problem with going third in a panel discussion or going late in the afternoon is you go through all your notes. And you take weeks and weeks to go through your notes. And then you check off what everybody else has said. Then when you're done, you get to something that looks like this. Everybody said everything they want to talk about. I come from the private sector. In the private sector, if somebody has a good idea, you do it. Then I came to the public sector. In the public sector, if somebody has a good idea, you study it. And then you study it. And then you study it. Drives me absolutely crazy at times. Alan Hamill told me one time, you need to slow down. So I slowed down, and he goes, slower. And this is literally water time is what we deal with. I'm not gonna talk about the gap that's been covered. I guess what I wanna touch briefly on is the state water plan. And my vision of the state water plan, and what the state water plan, what I believe it will do and what it will not do. Something the state water plan will not do is tweak the prior appropriation system. I saw a newscast the other day where somebody from the Arkansas Basin was being interviewed, and he said they're going to tweak the prior appropriation system. I think I must have missed that meeting because I've never heard us talk about tweaking the prior appropriation system. The state water plan is not going to be a bunch of Black Hawk helicopters landing on Main Street saying we're here to take your water. That's not what's going to happen either. The state water plan cannot be strictly about conservation. We talk about conservation over and over, how conservation can get us out of our problems. I've seen PowerPoint presentations where it can show conservation can get us out of our problems. But you can't have total conservation. Municipalities have got to have, medium, moderate conservation just in case it gets worse. Then they can always get into water restrictions. You've got to have options. A trans-mountain diversion that would dry up the west slope. I don't think you're going to see anything like that. I think what we'll see in the state water plan is got to be options. It's got to be options, it's got to be balanced. It's got to be balanced for agriculture, municipalities, industry, and the environment. And I think that's what we are looking for with it. I think that we will be successful in getting a state water plan. I think we will come up with options. We're not going to shove this down anybody's throat. It's going to be, these are the options if you want to continue to have the Colorado that we are all used to having. So that's my piece.
All right. Thanks, Jay.
I'm Jarvis Danielson. Some of you may remember my former reign of care as state engineer. And you're getting old. When we were trying to talk about what are we going to talk about, Gary told me, he said, you've been around a long time. Why don't you talk about what the dialogue was like in the old days?
He knew Mr. Bent when he owned the fort.
No, I just want to talk a little bit about the development and the history and the brainchild that the Basin Roundtable program was. Some of you may remember a guy by the name of Russell George. He was director of DNR, he was director of DOW, he was head of the highway department. Now he's living over in Rangeley. I don't know who he upset, but I've never been to Rangeley anyway. But Russ looked around at the dialogue that was taking place in the water community. And I've always likened the water, what we do as water buffaloes. It's a religion. We have our own temples. They're called the water courts. We have our own Bible. It's Title 37 in the Colorado statutes. We have our own lexicon and language. I defy any normal citizen to walk into a water buffalo meeting and understand anything that's going on. And Russ kind of looked at that and said, this probably is not being real inclusive in terms of bringing other citizenry into the equation. So he came up with the idea of the roundtable. And the idea, historically, the only water dialogue that took place at the state level was in the Colorado Water Conservation Board. Now, this is an entity that has done many, many great things. But when you look at the structure of it, there are, I believe, 9 members, only 3 of whom come from east of the Continental Divide, where 90% of the population is, and probably 90% of the money. 4 come from West Slope basins, and the other 2, one comes from North Park, which has a total population of 3,500 people, and the other one comes from the Rio Grande Basin. And you heard them this morning say, we're just dropping out. don't come over here. We have nothing to offer you. We're not a part of the dialogue. So, and there was no environmental representation or recreational representation. So Russ decided, let's do this, let's flip this over and let's start at the grassroots. And we'll create these basin roundtables. Every one of you who lives in the Arkansas Basin has a representative on the roundtable, whether you know it or not. How many of you know your rep? Yeah, that's about 5%. Well, you need to find out who these people are. Because the whole concept is for the ordinary citizen to have a way of communicating interests and desires and concepts that will filter up through the roundtable and then into the IBCC. So I would encourage you very, very much to be active in the roundtable process. It's slow. It's not quite water time, but it's slow. If you think it's water time, come to the IBCC. Just one comment on the state water plan. And I guess James is gone, so he won't.
No, he's over there.
I'm leaving now, though.
Should have left earlier.
I do have concerns. When the governor issued his first executive order creating mandating the creation of a state water plan, I asked the question at IBCC, is the legislature going to be involved in this? Are they going to put their imprint of approval on it or what? And it was an emphatic no. This is not to be part of what the legislature is going to do. Well, 2 years later, we see bills introduced that says the legislature is going to have to take a look at this thing. And I'm really concerned that without legislative approval of some kind, you get a new governor and he goes, what's this thing? It's out the window. And there'll be a lot of money and a lot of time spent down the tubes. I always go back and how many of you knew Glenn Saunders? One person. See, I've learned I'm getting really old.
You're old.
Saunders was the premier water attorney for the Denver Water Board. And every year in the legislature, some bright-eyed legislator would come up with the idea, we need a state water plan. And a bill would get introduced, and there'd be all kinds of testimony and jaw-jacking about it. And Saunders would wait until the very last minute, and he'd go down to the committee, and he would say, we have a state water plan. It's called the priority system. Now, I'm not that pessimistic. I think the state water plan can come up with some guidelines, but it's not going to be a state water project.
Okay, so you're getting the flavor for this now, right? Okay, so 2004, House Bill 1177 creates the roundtables. We are charged to turn in our homework and describe how we're going to meet our needs. And then SWASI 2010 comes along and updates the needs assessment and captures a lot of the work we did. And then we get to this thing called the 4 legs of the stool. So I'm going to walk you through just a couple slides, and then when we get to the 4 legs of the stool, I'll also tell you what IBCC means. So part of our challenge in the Arkansas Basin is we're an importing basin and we're an exporting basin. So if they're paranoid in the Gunnison, we know we're paranoid. The question is, are we paranoid enough? So this water's coming in and it's going out, and it makes it very complicated. But also we have we're using this Colorado River water essentially for a lot of our recreational and environmental economy. So water being brought over and stored at the top, and Turquoise and Twin Lakes is being retimed down the river to create the rafting industry and then captured in Pueblo. So it's very much linked and integrated. So this was the report we put together in 2009. SWASI 2004 told us we had a gap in the year 2030. What are you going to do about that gap? In this report, we said we're going to try to do 2 things. One, we're going to try to pursue this rotating fallowing or lease fallowing or some kind of alternative to permanent ag dry up. We're going to chase that. And coincidentally, a man named Aaron Million had filed a water right in Wyoming on the Green River, and there was a realization that what happens next on the Colorado River directly affects the Arkansas Basin, and that we were stakeholders and that we needed to step up to that. And we used the term sustainability to try to understand how these various pieces fit together. Two more slides and I'll come back to the panel. The other thing we learned in that process was in some basins, the blue line is real estate developed on top of where there used to be agriculture. And the red line is real estate developed where the water came from somewhere else. So in our case, most of the water coming off the farms in the Arkansas isn't to go into homes near the farm or where the farm used to be. So if you're in Greeley and you're growing out into the cornfields, it's the same water that's coming out of the cornfield that's going into the municipal system. In our case, because we're an importing and exporting basin, some of that water is going to a different part of the basin or even to another basin. And so that's a challenge. So what are these four legs of the stools we talk about? First, the Interbasin Compact Committee is the Uber Committee, 2 representatives from each of the 9 roundtables, 6 appointees from the governor, the head of the House Ag Committee, the chair of the Senate Ag Committee, John Stolp, God bless him, is the chair of that committee, and they are having this big statewide dialogue. They came up with this idea of there are really 4 legs to the stool. Conservation is one, some kind of alternative to ag transfers, permanent ag transfers, new supply, which is a term that we're still trying to figure out what it means, but basically now is defined as a transbasin diversion, and then identified projects and processes. And then we added, here's my cool animation, we added the idea of storage, right? That storage was the thing that connected all 4 of these, and that without storage, none of this made sense. So we went through this exercise called the portfolio tool. Solve for how much irrigated agriculture you use based on how much conservation you think you're willing to do, how much new supply you think you can get, and what your projects are going to deliver. And in our case, over here in the Arkansas, we lost 30% of our farmland. So the equation solved for irrigated acres lost. But that portfolio tool gave us a pretty good place to start having the dialogue about these 4 legs of the stool. So the 4 legs of the stool are intended to meet the M&I gap. We had some pushback about that in terms of why is M&I water more important than ag water or more important than environmental water. And so let me stop here and ask our panelists if any of them have a comment on this picture, and then we'll kind of go this way for a few slides.
I need your microphone.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, I think maybe we do have state water project. Maybe it's really going on, Jared. Just thought I'd point that out. You know, you talk about ATM, alternative agricultural methods, you know. That's the antithesis of fly and dry, I guess you might call it. But, you know, the state of Colorado has helped underwrite, helped provide grant funding so that we can develop tools to be able to do rotational crop and lease fallowing instead of fly and dry. And one of those tools we're actually working on. It's being funded by grants through the Colorado Water Conservation Board's ATM program. And that tool is to help develop the technical skills in engineering so that we could mitigate or prevent injury from temporary transfers of water through like lease fallowing, for example. That tool will help calculate the amount of, accurately the amount of consumptive use that could be transferable consumptive use off of fallowed ground, and also what type of mitigation has to take place
to maintain historic return flow, so there's no injury or water rights. The idea of the tool is that it'll become a common technical platform that anyone can use, either the proponent of a lease fallowing project or the objectors to prevent injury to their water rights. We could use the same technical platform, ostensibly to reduce the cost of those types of temporary changes. But then the legislature went a little bit further and decided, well, we need to do a pilot project. And it's something that our roundtable talked about. We need a pilot project to test these tools, to test this process. And so the legislature passed legislation so that pilot projects could happen. So in some way of looking at it, we really do have the state being active in a water project to be able to provide water for an M&I gap as an alternative to a permanent buy and dry. So I just put that out there as something. I think we need to go further than that. I think that once we get the state water plan done, I believe the state needs to help us undertake large storage projects so that these four legs of the stool can actually happen. But I think those projects have to be multi-purpose type projects. Jim alluded to that earlier in his comments. It has to take into account consumptive and non-consumptive, recreation, environmental. It has to take into account all of those things, agriculture and so forth. I don't believe that we are now at a point, I think, that where individual entities cannot do it. They cannot do it alone. I think it's going to take a state input into this. Maybe not a direct sponsorship of it, but at least state help. And I think that's where it needs to go. And I think that's where the state water plan, in my opinion, I think that's where it will head.
Great. Jim? This way. Yeah, okay.
I guess when I look at this slide and you look at the way it's laid out, it's geared from a M&I perspective to try to figure out how you can stretch municipal and industrial water further. And so you have the tools that are either new supply, conservation, ag alternative transfers, the ATMs, and then you have to figure out what kind of projects would do that for you. Well, the question that I ask is, that's great if your view is M&I. But what if your view is recreation? Or what if your view is environmental? Or what if your view is agriculture? So the discussion in the earlier years was trying to meet a demand for population impact on the state of Colorado. And that was the driving force and the question asked. Over the years, it's evolved. And we're trying to take a model that we used 10 years ago, 8 years ago, and bring it forward and say, how's it working? I argue that you just take the center dot out and put where you're sitting and make sure that your needs are met, and how they look and what they will be. And I think the Arkansas is real close to doing that. I'm pretty proud of some of that. Some of the piece that's hard to gauge is if I put agriculture in the center, then what's the baseline? Are we trying to take the baseline back to 1860? When some of the older water rights in place? Are we going to take it to 1890, 1898, 1920, 1930? When do you start taking the picture? The other question that I think is relevant when we talk about the plan is, do we understand how the water is used in different times with regards to drought, an average time, and a wet period? We're all pretty good about saying, well, there's about an average this amount. But that doesn't do any good when you're in a drought and you've only got 6,000 acre feet. Average doesn't mean anything. And so you have to figure out how can you collaboratively meet the needs of all the different parties that need the water. If you sit and have a discussion, and the classic one in my mind is running water down a river to meet a primary purpose, but as you run it, you have secondary purposes that are being met. And the question that I always have when we start to run water is, well, you can't put too much water in it because we can't raft. Too high is not good. Or too little is not good because then we hit our butts on the rocks. So that's not good. And then the anglers will come over and say, wait a minute, you can't put that much, just the opposite, because they can't stand in the river. They can't fish in the river. And the fish can't take it. So how do you start to balance the needs of agricultural needing the water to grow the crops for the population? Municipals needing water for their peak demands, which indeed just so happens to be the same time that the water's running. Those needs to ensure that the economic engine on the valley is being run, in the upper valley, is being run during the time period that recreation is in place. And then how do you ensure that you protect the environment? Though this diagram, I think, literally is a layover from each area you look at. And I think that's how we're going to have to start to address it. One last piece. I also believe you cannot find one plan. So let me say that again. I don't think you will find one plan, because what works for us does not work for the Gunnison, does not work for the Rio Grande, does not work for the Colorado. They're different. So I believe you will have layovers and have different criteria on the layover because things are different. And I think you'll start to see that develop as we move.
All right. I forgot to say, these are our two IBCC reps, Jay Winter and Jairus Danielson, which give us the reputation as a rambunctious roundtable. You guys want to comment on this one, or we'll?
Well, I think this slide refers to the balance that we were talking about. That's got to be a balanced program. I agree with Jim that, I guess what Jim was basically saying is every basin is going to have different options. There's got to be options in every single basin. I agree with Terry that we are looking at a state water plan and probably a state water project. And by agreeing with Terry, I now therefore disagree with Jairus. I believe that any plan, any project that we have out there has got to be a state water project, is what we have to do. Sitting at the IBCC for the number of years I've been sitting there, we get along okay. Over the last couple of meetings, we've been getting along better. One of the very first IBCC meetings that I attended, a gentleman walked in, a new guy to IBCC out of the Rock County. First thing out of his mouth was, and I felt sorry for Heather Bergman, I think she was on her second or third meeting. First words out of his mouth was, let me tell you something, environmentalists, they're nothing but a bunch of blackmailers and extortionists. Well, we continue to go downhill from there, I think. So I do think this is the balance that we're looking at. The state has funded many projects that we've looked at. The most recent one was 1248, and that was a pilot project. Terry talked about the common technical platform, engineering that we all agree on, something that we all agree on. So we kind of threw this one against the wall to see if it would stick. And we had many, many meetings. And we walked out of the meetings on 1248, and we said, I think we all agree on something. We have a common technical platform. We all agree. We submitted our plan for the pilot program, 240 pages of comments. But I thought we all agreed that this was a common technical platform. So it's a learning experience. Whenever you go through these, I believe in pilot programs, I believe in demonstration projects. I think you have to go through this to see if you are making mistakes, and mistakes you learn from them. I also believe that this is, it's got to be that balanced approach that we're looking for. Thank you.
Jairus?
Yeah. Did you ever try and build a four-legged stool and get it to sit level? Just an observation. Two legs I'd like to comment. One is the issue of conservation, and this has been a very hotly debated issue at the IBCC particularly. Some of the environmental community has taken the position, you know, until M&I users are getting 50% conservation, they're going to be very unhappy if we talk about new storage, new trans-mountain diversions, or anything of that nature. Now, it's easy to take that position, but they never go talk to the guys that are providing the water. And is that goal achievable? Or what slow friends take the position, you guys better be conservation minded over there and squeeze every drop of water. Well, what about you? Well, what do we care? We got all the water over there. We don't have to be. The other thing, and I think it's a little more insidious here, is the leg of the stool dealing with ag originally was called ag dry-up. And through our efforts, I think, through the Art Roundtable, we've been able to get some of the basins at least to consider alternative methods of transfer. But hidden behind that is ag dry, because it's the easiest, cleanest, quickest, cheapest way for a city to get water. And I think we have to be very, very aware of that issue. And it isn't just on the east slope. West slope ag, over in the Uncompahgre Valley, is faced with ag dry up right now. And let me tell you, if Denver starts running out of water, I had a conversation with Chips Berry, who used to be the manager of Denver Water. And I said, Chips, I know you've got in your pocket a checkbook and a list of ag users on the west slope that you can walk over and buy them out tomorrow. And he said, absolutely. And that scares the bejesus out of the west slope.
Well, I want to comment on this conservation.
Great.
We had talked about conservation at the IBCC level, and people would say, well, you need to have very, very high conservation. You know, basically, no more Kentucky bluegrass, you got to have high conservation on the east slope. Okay, well, we need to build a reservoir. Well, no, you can't build a reservoir. Well, if you want us to have high conservation, where do we put it? Well, you got to have a reservoir to put it in. So that was some of the conflict at the beginning of the IBCC meetings, where we finally gotten through some of that. But that's a lot of stuff we've been dealing with over the last few years.
So what we're going to do is just go through these four legs real quick, and you guys are hanging in there. You're doing great. So we've talked a little bit about conservation. These are photos from my yard. I'm a Car Springs Utilities customer, and they provided us motivation a couple of years ago to do more conservation in the form of our bill. So you've heard the term xeriscape. The guy on the top right-hand, it's called xeroscape, right? He has no turf left at all in his yard. And the other one is what I call the throw rug versus wall-to-wall carpeting. So people have shifted their way of thinking about that, but they've been motivated by their pocketbooks. And this actually is a lot better than the folks who just say, well, heck with that, and they just let their yard go and it's dirt. So comments over on this side about conservation, or on to the next one?
I'll just go ahead and go on.
Okay.
I have to agree with Jay, and that's unusual, but I think we have to have stories, you know.
That's not at all like a roundtable meeting.
Well, one other thing on conservation, because you have to be careful when you talk about conservation. My wife and I, we live in Pueblo, we have one of the big Victorians, and the front of the house is southern exposure. Those houses were built so you didn't have to have air conditioning, you could have a very efficient system. Well, we had the idea that we wanted to see our house better, so we cut down the trees in the front of the house. Well, the temperature inside the house skyrocketed. So now what we had to do is get air conditioning. Well, air conditioning takes electricity. Electricity takes water. So a person's got to be very, very careful when you talk about, you know, your levels of conservation. It's like I said, it's a balancing act that you have to do.
Right, and so what you'll see in the second panel is how these pieces tie back into the Basin plan. Let me just put a plug in for Gene Van Pelt and the Southeast Conservancy District. They've got a regional water conservation plan toolbox. It's available online, and our conservation consultant will talk about that in a little bit. Part of what Terry talked about was this is how we went after the four legs of the stool for alternative transfer methods. The technical studies, the policy, the legislature wanting to help us, what statutes would be helpful, and then the idea of pilot projects. And here's a little more detailed version of that. It's kind of hard to read, but the idea is we've been going after this since '09. And we've been going at it vigorously and with a lot of help from the Colorado Water Conservation Board. They also had a separate ATM grant program, and we availed ourselves of that. And we're still not done. So one of the things you're going to see in the Basin plan, if you get an early copy of it after the July 30th deadline, is it'll say this page intentionally not left blank. Right? We're going to have stuff that goes in there that's work in progress, and these tracks are good examples of that. Terry or Jim, you want to add anything to that? You guys good?
Well, a little bit.
There you go.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
I didn't cover it completely. This technical platform isn't completed yet. There was a beta version that was going to be used by Super Ditch's last application that got pulled because they didn't have any, they couldn't get an agreement with the water supply. But other than that, that tool should be completed by somewhere around 2015 is when it's scheduled.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's important, by the way, I'm going to add this, that before we do a pilot project, we should have a completed tool.
So we used to watch football, and when the guy would run into the line and get tackled without gaining any yardage, my mom would say, "Why do they run that stupid play?" Right? Why don't they run a play where the guy makes some yards? So I think that's a little bit of our experience with pilot projects. We're running the play. One of these days, we're going to break loose and. What's that?
You still on ATMs?
I am. You want to comment on that?
Sure. Something else on ATM that always comes up, pilot projects, super ditch projects, leasing fallowing. This is not an original idea. This was originally, the first that I had seen it was in Palo Verde, California. And in Palo Verde, they had quite the challenge, and that was called Los Angeles and San Diego. They're the ones that needed water. And they were able to sit down and cut a deal with San Diego and Los Angeles so that those communities could have water. It's been done in the Arkansas Basin. Aurora did it with the High Line. What we're trying to do is take it to yet another level, is what we're trying to do. And I do understand, I just love letting the air out of Ivan Walters' balloon. I understand that it could be up to 30%. And it, is 30% a dry up? Yeah, in some cases you could consider it a dry up. But I do believe it's a better alternative than what we're facing now, which is complete buy and dry of agriculture. I think this is what I like to call it the option. And it's an option that can possibly keep agriculture viable.
And we will have questions, and Ivan, you'll get your chance. Okay, so IPPs, Identified Plans and Processes. One of our challenges in the original SWASI and even in SWASI 2010 was we only had a handful of these. So the other thing that's coming soon, and it'll be part of the next panel, is this idea of an input form. And if there are projects out there that the roundtable should consider that we're not aware of, we'd like to hear about them. But these are the three that were in the SWASI 2004 and SWASI 2010 report. Southern Delivery is under construction. Arkansas Valley Conduit has got a record of decision, and the funding's ongoing. We don't have a pipe, but we have a plan, right, a project approved. And the preferred storage option plan, which was a way to get more storage capacity out of Pueblo Reservoir. And Jim, you want to comment about how that evolved a little bit?
The preferred storage option plan was a plan that underwent the analysis of trying to determine what needs the valley needed for storage. Original plan, literally 50 to 60 different project areas to look at on where you could put storage, how much you could put there. It ultimately boiled down to three major components. One, enlargement of Pueblo Reservoir. So for those of you that know Pueblo Reservoir, if you look at the dam, there's a spillway. And if you take the spillway and move it up parallel with the rest of the dam, that's 75,000 acre feet of storage. That's the enlargement portion. So now you have to put some more weight on the side of the dam to make sure the dam stays there. Okay, that's a little issue. But that was the first process. The second one was looking at a enlarging turquoise reservoir to provide upper storage at about 25,000 acre feet further down the line. The third piece was to use excess capacity in the Pueblo Reservoir. And so and that was the target of what people were working. So excess capacity in a reservoir is that space that is assigned for storage, but nobody puts their water in it, or they put a portion of it and still has room to put more in. The good news is over the time period, and I'll go from 2003 because I'm familiar with that because that's when I landed through the door. So we'll do it from there. In 2003, we started looking at Pueblo Reservoir and started looking at how you can increase the storage. Today, or at the end of the summer when we finish the last master contract, there'll be close to 95,000 acre feet of storage that was in Pueblo Reservoir that wasn't in there in 2003. So that's taking a pretty good whack at the discussion that people say, well, Jim, why do you want to enlarge Pueblo Reservoir if you haven't used the damn reservoir yet? I think that was a valid question. I think now that the reservoir is now having more water in it, it will move forward. So PSOP, we kind of tipped it and decided to get the, if and when, the excess capacity storage in place, so that that would be in place before you started to provide other storage. As a side note to that, and I'll get done with it very quick, the game is how do you move the water? You store it and you have to move it, the infrastructure part of it. You have to be able to move, and I don't care what you're using for it. You've got to be able to have infrastructure to move it. If you don't have infrastructure to move it, then you built yourself a big reservoir that doesn't use its primary purpose. So when we get further down, we'll talk a little bit about moving the water so you can understand the critical need of moving the water as it relates to the state plan.
Okay, we're doing great up here. I don't know how you guys are doing, but we're doing great. So the last of the four legs is new supply, now sometimes called trans-basin diversions. I was in a former career field, and we talked a lot about winning and losing, and that there was something that comes ahead of winning, and it's called not losing. So the idea of not losing comes ahead of winning, and so for us in the new supply conversation, part of the dialogue in 2009 was we had a lot to lose. We were going to lose a lot of agriculture to meet our growth, or perhaps more importantly, somebody was going to go over to the big buckets like Flaming Gorge and build a pipeline and be senior to our priorities in the Colorado. So in March of 2009, we had the Colorado River folks come over. Jim Pokrantz was one of those. Eric Kuhn, the executive director of the Colorado River District. State was doing a water supply study on the Colorado River at the time. And it was about like this. It's around 2 in the afternoon. Everybody's ready to doze off. And Eric Kuhn says, oh, and by the way, the energy companies have conditional water rights on the Colorado system that are all senior to most of the diversions into the Arkansas. And boy, everybody just sort of came, what did that guy say? What was that? So all of a sudden it became really important for us to understand what was going on over there. And then you got a guy named Aaron Millian, and he's kind of running around trying to figure out how he can get his piece of the cake. So we said, we better figure this out from our side. We have a lot to lose, and we can't afford to lose it. You know, one of the themes you'll hear is, we know we have a gap. Don't let the gap get bigger, right? So we did a couple of things. We did an assessment. We did a project exploration committee. We didn't want to use the F word, Flaming Gorge. But we did a report and talked about, and this sort of goes to that question, roundtables don't have any authority. You can't sue us as the roundtable. We can't sue you as the roundtable. We don't have any ability to bind anyone. But in this Flaming Gorge process, this project exploration committee, I believe we asserted our moral authority. What does good look like? Let's talk about what a good plan would look like, or a good project would look like. And now that new supply conversation is dynamic, and it's particularly dynamic not only within Colorado, and I really like the idea that we're thinking of it as Coloradoans, but also the upper basin, lower basin states. So I'm going to stop one more time, see if, we'll start on this end. Jairus, you want to start? Do you have any comments on that?
I was going to talk about conservation.
That'll be during the break if you want to talk about conservation.
I'm concerned, we've got 50 minutes left and we're almost out of slides.
Don't worry. We have lots of, these people have questions, I can tell.
Well, on new supply, we've had a lot of dialogue, or not very much dialogue, at the IDCC level, because the West Slope position consistently is not one more dam. And when you hear them speak of the Colorado River, they speak, that's our river. You guys used up all of your rivers over there. This is our river. Well, when you look at the interstate compact, the Upper Colorado Compact, it doesn't allocate water to the west slope of Colorado. It allocates water to the citizens of the state of Colorado. And I think we're starting now to break through. Jay and I have rolled enough hand grenades under the IBCC table that the West Slope is starting to begin to think about commencing maybe a dialogue on trans-basin diversion. Now, I asked Jim Popance this morning, the Yampa White has taken the position that they are entitled to a carve-out in perpetuity of any water that might be unused in Colorado River. This is totally antithetical to Colorado water. And you heard John Plow say, we don't buy that at all. Well, why does Yampa White take that position? They're the most junior water rights on the West Slope. Southwest, they're happy, they're all the senior water. So we're going to see a real interesting catfight on the West Slope just over the issue of how do we allocate that. I'll quit here. I want to talk
Okay.
about conservation.
Other thoughts, Jim, Terry, Jay?
Yeah, the new supply has been interesting, to say the least. At the IBCC level, we were devoting 2014 to talking about just new supply. When this happened, I thought it was great. I could just sit back, because we had really, really good lunches. And I could just sit back and watch the sparks fly and not really get involved. And then I just couldn't help myself, I guess.
That's an understatement right there.
Just couldn't help myself. And we actually got a dialogue started on new supply. And after 6 years, it came up with the East Slope is now looking for firm yield from a trans-mountain diversion project and would accept West Slope hydrological risk for the project. Mark Waggy, I believe, said that. Mark Waggy says that. Eric Kuhns from the West Slope goes, I can live with that. Those two sentences started a dialogue where we, I think, are finally putting a framework around what a new supply could actually look like coming west to east. It's amazing how after 6 years, just a few sentences can cause that sort of reaction. Other stuff that we're working on a new supply, and it's hard to understand why, if we are able to store 200,000 acre feet in Blue Mesa, how that helps the Arkansas. That's a compact call. If you have 200,000 acre feet sitting in Blue Mesa, and there's a call to the Colorado River, for a lot of these trans-mountain diversions do not have to be shut off. This is yet another project that we're working on that I consider to be new supply. But I think that we will get a framework. I would not be surprised if we get it done by the July 1st deadline of some sort of framework on what could be considered a compact between the east and the west slope. I am forever the optimist.
And that's the beauty of this whole thing. Jay was not an optimist when I first met him. So what happened is we did this thing in 2009, 2010, we get SWASI, it's looking out to the year 2050, and it kind of captures everything we've been doing and where we should go next, particularly the non-consumptive needs analysis we had done, the recreational issues, right, these interconnects. So by 2012, we're in the go mode as the Arkansas Basin. And we wrote an update to our 2009 plan, and we essentially said we're going into the implementation mode. And we also got into this idea, and we'll come to it in a second, about maybe we need to start defining our baseline of agriculture differently than just number of acres, and treat it as an economic thing. And then the other thing we learned was we had some areas in the basin that weren't very well represented. We had some empty seats that had never been filled, and that if we were going to really be advocates for the whole basin and try to go into some implementation modes, we needed to find out, we needed to bring those people into the room. So let me go one more here. So in our 2012 update, we had these roundtable summits. That was a part of the interesting discussion about conservation where somebody said, oh, well, you guys have to do it, but we don't. That led to that idea of one size fits all. But one of the things we learned in those couple of years was, and if you can read that, you don't need glasses. What it says is the Colorado Springs and Pueblo, who are importing a lot of water from the Colorado Basin, and that water is fully consumable because it's new water to the system, are applying that to the gap. So they don't have a municipal supply gap because they've got all this water they can reuse. Oh, wait a minute, we're also using that water for augmentation in the lower valley, and we're farming on it. So what we learned was that maybe we were double counting it, and maybe the way SWASI 2010 had looked at the M&I gap, no one disagreed. Do you have a problem in 2050? Yeah, I got a problem in 2050. Do I have a problem right now? Yeah, I got a problem right now. I may have a gap in double counting this municipal water supply and applying that to the gap, all this return flow being applied to the gap, and I'm farming on it. And so we're back to this idea, you got to know where you are before you can figure out where you're going, right? So let me stop on that comment, and then I'll put my next piece of animation. Any other thoughts on this one?
No, I want to talk about conservation.
All right. Jim.
I think the piece that really the light bulb went off was 2 years ago. It was a dry year for imports, and for those of you that are visiting down here, it's been a dry year here for about 9 years. We're on equal par with California. I'm just doing that so in case if there's legislation being passed in North California, don't forget Southern Colorado. The discussion kind of went this way. What are you going to do? The discussion Gary's talking about is how you do the double count. And when you have a low year, you start having people say, well, my augmentation plan, where do I get the water? And so for those of you that know augmentation plans, take a break for a second. For those of you who don't, it's basically finding water to make up that amount of water that you're using to pump that you don't have the right to, basically. So in the basin, and 2 years ago, we're pretty straightforward. There's not going to be a whole lot of water available for that. So it starts to have an economic impact on a basin, specifically on communities like we're sitting in now, agricultural communities, the selling of equipment, et cetera, et cetera. A year before that, we had a very high year, and so we had lots of water. So we've kind of done that roller coaster piece twice. Last year, we were afraid we were going to have another low year, and it almost got to, quote, average. And this year is a high water year for importing, not for native flow. In other words, the flows in the rivers here are pretty dry, except for the upper Arkansas. But if you look at the rivers that feed this part of the state, it's Jarris 50% maybe of what we're typically doing.
He's doing conservation.
I think it's 50%. So the question that I want to bring up is that when we realize that, why are we not planning to the year we know that we're going to have? Why are we all still thinking we're at average? And every year, everybody comes up, and when they ask for water, I can guarantee you, I can tell the 11 ditches exactly what they're gonna ask for, because they're not doing any plan. They got a number, and they just throw it out there, and every year, I get the same number. It doesn't matter if there's 4 billion gallons or acres of water coming down, or 2. I'll get the same numbers. The question then in my mind comes is if you plan for a low year, then you kind of know what you got. If you plan for a higher year, you know what you got. And here's a concept that's very difficult to understand. Save some for next year. Well, to save some for next year, agriculture has to have a place to put it. That's that circle leg on the four-legged stool that we keep harping about, or I keep harping about. If you don't, let me give you an example. For replacement in the Arkansas Basin, for a replacement pool, on a high year, we use about 65,000 acre-feet for replacement. Average year is about 40, and a dry year is about 22. Those waters come from places like municipalities that don't need the water because they store, unless if you have a dry year and then they need the water, and then you don't have water available for agriculture. That's the gap that we're talking about, that light started to go on, and people are starting now to look at it differently with regards to analyzing how the water comes in and how you use it.
Comments over here?
Well, yeah, I just want to comment on the double counting, what Jim was talking about, the planning. The world I come from, you have to plan. You know, planning is a good thing. We, Kansas in about 2009, they looked at our sprinklers, and the bums from Kansas said, you guys are, you're consuming too much water. You owe us water. So we spent quite a bit of time putting together what we call the Rule 10 plan. Well, I'm looking at the Rule 10 plan, and it's like, we got a problem, because where are we going to get the water from? You know, what happens when Public Board of Water Works doesn't have any water to lease to us anymore? So then, on one of my long drives, I started thinking about the wells. I was like, well, they got a problem too, don't they? Because they need to make sure they have water. And planning on Public Board of Water Works, a good hydrology, and other people not buying water, that's not a very good plan to have. You got to have a plan in place. So 2011, I started talking about what are we going to do with this? And I was told everything's fine. In 2012, I was actually told by a couple associations that you need to shut up, you're scaring people. Well, we all know what happened in 2013, don't we? Yeah. So we started planning, and you plan as best you can, and sometimes it doesn't work. With the Rule 10 plan, we started doing our projections. We did 3% growth. We're going to follow the South Platte, 3% growth with sprinklers. Well, what happened this year? The number of sprinklers, they doubled in size. And what we are showing this year is 100% growth, and we think we're going to have an average of about 12% growth every single year. What we're trying to do with planning, and that's why planning is so important for agriculture, is make sure these guys have 3 types of water supplies. Spot market, return flows of some sort, and the ability to use their surface water rights for their sprinklers. So you've got a plan, and sometimes plans don't work out exactly as you thought they were going to.
So,
No, I want to talk about the ag gap. I'll get to conservation. No, I am concerned though, we see the ag gap and it is very real. But the augmentation plans, the well augmentation entities, have relied a great deal on being able to purchase water from Pueblo, other sources for augmentation. I just read in the paper, I think 3 days ago, that Pueblo is going to sell some water for augmentation for $637 an acre. Now, you better start growing something other than alfalfa or corn if you're gonna try and augment your well with that kind of water. So I think there's a source of augmentation that we've relied on that's probably gonna dry up and go away as the cities grow and as industry has more demand. Now, on conservation, I just wanted to make a very quick comment. There's an old saying that, you know, one man's waste is another man's water right. And in the plant, they use the water that comes through Denver 7 times. So be careful what you ask for, particularly if you're agriculture. Everybody's for conservation, right? I mean, it's apple pie and Chevrolet. But when a city becomes very, very conservative in using their water, somebody who's been relying on those return flows is not going to have a water supply.
Yep, so it's all connected. The other thing we did was really try to understand the value of ag in the economy. And so we commissioned a study from Colorado State University, the Water Institute, and we got the results about 6 months ago. We had a conference in the fall where we brought folks from other states to talk about value of ag and how to look at that and the importance of agriculture. And so what we've done within the Basin Plan, at least initially in the first chapter, is try to talk about the economy of agriculture and how important it is to the basin. So this is the graphic from that. And then we had a pretty good response to our who's missing and the idea that we don't have many voices for the environmental interests and recreational interests. And this is a graphic that shows our original needs assessment. So we're on the home stretch. This is the extreme of hydrology we've been talking about. 2012 and 2011 on either end of the scale. And again, part of our challenge is the old days, you looked at snowpack on the 1st of April, that was a snowpack. Starting in 02 with the wind blowing, the snowpack on the 1st of April and the snowpack on the 1st of May were 30–40% different. I mean, the wind just picked it up and took it away. So that planning is even more challenging. So I'm back to our last graphic, which is storage is the key. It's the circle, however you want, whatever, 5-legged stool, whatever you want to call it, but that's really important for us because it gives us the ability to look at all the gaps. So what I'm going to do now is ask if these folks have any closing remarks. We're at 2:10. This panel theoretically goes to 2:30. You're tougher than me if you're still sitting in that chair, so good for you. We'll go to questions next, so we'll start on this end, Jairus. We'll go this way for last comments.
Okay. Yeah, I do have a last comment. I think each of you received a questionnaire to fill out. One of the purposes of this meeting is to gather public input. That's one of the charges the roundtable has. Fill that thing out. You need to understand that the roundtable has money. That should get your attention. We've given away, what, $3 million, Jim? $3 million to 4? You know, in terms of projects in the basin. And they weren't all studies. We've done things like Wiley's water tank fell over, so we... McLean. So we propped that back up. Round Mountain Water Company up in the Wet Mountain Valley had major issues with their well and with their pipeline. We gave them money to replace their well and the pipeline. There's a lot of projects that we've done that I'm very proud of. Out in Trinidad, we've restored about 3/4 of a mile of the river through the city, put in fish habitat, and we now, I hate to tell you this, if there's any fly fishermen here, but we now have a cold water fishery through the city of Trinidad. Now, you may look at the purgatory in the winter and go, I don't see how they made it, but they did, and they're propagating there, and I can show you where there's about a 22-inch ground. So I'm really proud of what the roundtable has done in terms of projects, but get involved. If you have an idea, So be it for me. Right?
We also did the zebra mussels for Pueblo Reservoir. There's been a lot of good stuff that the roundtable has done. I guess my closing remarks, because you always want to steal something from the guy that's going to be presenting tomorrow. Back in the 70s, I used to come to La Junta to go ice skating. They'd fill the park, ice go over that, ice would be there for all winter. You go ice skating. So global warming, I know somebody's going to talk about that tomorrow, and no one ever steals anything from Nolan. So I just had to get that plug out there that I believe global warming is something, and Nolan will be talking about it at great length tomorrow. Thank you.
All right, and we'll have more about that input stuff in the second panel.
I guess my closing comments are the following. We have to be collaborative, we have to be proactive, we have to be aware that budget cuts are everywhere. We have to make sure that we understand that there's lots of downsizing going on. We have to look at different ways to process. I think the transformation to the process is the key. As you've heard that we've talked about, is you better do some smart planning. You better be able to have some budget development. You better figure out ways for delivery. And you better figure out an infrastructure strategy. Because if you don't, we'll still be having these same discussions at the next iteration of this process.
Well, my comment basically is, and I think this last slide really summarizes where I'm talking about. In order to do effective conservation, we're going to need storage. The agricultural augmentation plans and augmentation plans in general are going to need storage. In wet years, you have to have a place to put that water, and you need that excess capacity to do it. But we all have to work together to get that done. I do not believe that one single individual entity anymore can go out and build those type of projects. I think it takes collaboration and a coalition amongst all of us to do that. And those projects have to be multi-purpose. So I think that's where we need to go.
Okay, we really appreciate your time. We've got a few minutes for questions, but if you need to jump up and go for any reason, you're welcome to do that now. So, floor's open for questions. You, young man.
I have a question for the board in general. I know that we concluded that storage is one of the main facets for the future gaming because that would be a possible solution for the M&I gap. But I also know that over time, the water that is stored could be lost due to evaporation and other facets. So I'm curious, what are some strategic solutions for effective and efficient storage of water for future gaps?
Good question. We pursued a study of alluvial aquifer storage, which they do in other states. We don't do much of here. Other comments?
Yeah, I was just going to say, underground storage, the plant uses it a great deal, and I think we have an opportunity. Our aquifer isn't as robust as the South Plant, but there's opportunity for groundwater storage and in some of the basins.
Yeah.
I think that storage isn't just for M&I. I mean, we need additional storage for agriculture. Agriculture, they can get a storage contract in Pueblo Reservoir just like I can get a storage contract in Pueblo Reservoir. And we have to pursue aquifer storage and high mountain storage.
And the guy from the high mountains.
Well, high mountain storage has its own problem. I think that you need a combination of alluvial storage along with traditional, surface water storage. I don't think you can have one or the other. It's got to be a balance between the two, and they have to be. The storage vessels have to be efficient storage vessels so that the evaporative loss isn't a smaller percentage of the total capacity of the reservoir. And they can be constructed that way if they're done properly.
Okay, any other questions? We'll go here and here, and then we'll ask anybody else that's got a question to come on down and ask them individually.
Roderick, up at Fort Collins, west of there's two places where they've been working on for the storage of water. And it sounds like they spent a lot of money and went along the way towards it. And is it feasible, and can they ever get the money to do those projects? One of them was North Dakota Reservoir, and the other one is just west of town and behind that first hog back there, off the Fruiter River.
I know both projects you're talking about. I believe, the first answer is yes, you can do them. The second part of that is that you need to have an awful lot of people involved to do that. And the reason I say that is, anytime you do large projects, you're spending a lot of money, you have to spread it across a fairly large population to be able to make it affordable. So the affordability is always a question. I'm a believer of utilizing the infrastructure you have in place because you've paid for it. You already have a footprint. You've already done, if you will, the environmental of the project. I don't know of a project in the western United States that can come forward that doesn't try to somehow use infrastructure in place already or spread as far as you can. The days of a utility building their own system, as I would believe, almost over. And if it isn't almost over, the population, when they decide to do it, will have a sticker shock for water rates. And so, as customers, you're going to have to either have a really, really good campaign to understand why you're doing it. An example of that in my mind is SDS. I think that is one of the best campaigns I've seen of that community understanding its long-term water concerns and understood the costs associated with that. But that's the exception around the West. It's not the norm. But those projects are available. I will tell you, though, my comment on funding was really straightforward. Projects are not inexpensive. They're very, very expensive. The conduit that we're looking at goes 130 miles. That's about 220 miles of connection. It's a $400 million project. And so you better understand financing, and you better understand the population that you're going to try to put those finances back on.
Okay, before we ask this last question, the folks from Colorado Springs Utilities have been supporting our watershed health process. They brought some really cool maps for you to look at. Part of what we're trying to do is bring everybody's voice in and look at these maps and tell us where the threats are and what we might be able to do about them. We'll talk about it in the next panel. I just want to put that plug in that outside by the registration, it wouldn't be a good plan if we didn't have good maps, right? So please take a look at those. And then your question, ma'am?
I guess I'm being extremely selfish being a native of Colorado, and I hear that part of our state is struggling, and yet we have maybe a little bit of an abundance in another area. And I'm not saying take from that, but after we meet the needs, before we send it to another state, why can we not get some pipeline and get it down to the southern area that would help in this area where we are here, and get that excess to our state first? Part of the reason I say that, like I said, I'm being selfish, I guess, because I've been to other state water things, and I'm standing in Arizona, who runs their water year-round, when they're farming bring that gentleman's shirt. And I'm like, are you kidding me? When I said I was from Colorado, everybody got real quiet. And then, other states assume, because of what they hear on the news, I was in Kansas, and they told me that we are, 143% above, and I'm like, that's not the whole state. So, maybe we need to reach out. We're getting money from the oil and gas side of it in regards to helping some of our roundtables and, conservancy districts and things like that. Ask them for the extra pipeline. I don't care what it looks like. Let's just put it in there and get it down here. I mean, when we're over and above, we have to be thinking outside the box and put that in the Colorado plan and start engineers. We got a lot of smart engineers, in the state of Colorado, so.
Could you repeat the question? I'm just kidding. Comments? Well, I think
John Edwin told me it's not illegal.
No, I think the key is, it's a nice setup for our next panel. We wanted you all to understand that there's been a tremendous amount of work, a tremendous amount of dialogue, and I think a continually increasing level of respect for everyone's use of water and really how connected it all is. And that there is no them, unless it's the people downstream, right? We're all in Colorado, it's us, it's not us versus them, unless you want to start talking about the real them, right? Those guys in Kansas. So we appreciate your time. Next panel is at 12:45. Don't miss the maps, and if you're on the next panel, please come up here and we'll chat for just a minute.